And so when Moses strikes the rock a second time, he is doing great injury to what that first striking signified. Christ will only die once. And Numbers has about 36 chapters. And so the book itself covers a generation, 40 years. So you would think that by the time you get to Numbers 20, you'd be about halfway through that 40-year period. But we're not. We're at the end. So only a few weeks ago, we were looking at God barring that generation from the promised land because of unbelief. And he says, you're all going to die in the wilderness, but for Caleb, Joshua, their families, those 20 and under. And then within a number of chapters, we sort of fast forward to 40 years. The Bible does that a lot. God's word is highly selective in the history it gives us. And so maybe it's merciful that we don't get all this extra information on all those 40 years. It must have been a very bleak period because it was simply waiting for people to die. God was keeping alive those who would go into the promised land, and he was waiting for the rest to perish. And so in Numbers 20, we have events taking place in the 40th year after they started out. And we're going to answer the question today, what did they learn in those 40 years? What did that generation learn after 40 years? In Numbers 20, you have bookends. And the bookends are the death and funeral of Moses' sister Miriam, beginning of chapter 20, and then the death and burial of his brother Aaron that we read towards the end of chapter 20. And this is pretty bleak. Moses loses his older sister, his older brother. And what happens in between those bookends, not very pleasant, not very good. And yet it is God's history of his people. There'd be some devastating losses suffered, but probably the hardest thing for Moses was that he would suffer because of his own disobedience. Now, we have seen week after week, whether it's the children of Israel, whether it's the mixed multitude, whether it's Moses' own family, coming at Moses relentlessly, coming at him, complaining, and God defends him to the hilt. And so it might be tempting for us to think, well, the leader can do no wrong, or the leader's untouchable. He's untouchable. I mean, whenever they come after him, God defends him. Well, not exactly, because leaders can do wrong, and Moses does do wrong in this chapter, and he does pay the penalty. Though God had defended him many times before, these actions of Moses in Numbers 20 do not spare him from God's chastening hand. Now, in verse 2 of Numbers 20, we have a familiar problem of there being no water, which is not surprising. It's the wilderness. That's what a wilderness is famous for. You don't go to the wilderness for the water. Okay, that's not a selling point for living out in the wilderness. Wildernesses are known for no water. It doesn't mean that it was all desert, but there were some dry portions. But there is no water. We know in Exodus 17, God had provided water miraculously. And God could do so again. And in verse 2 it says, they gathered together against Moses and Aaron. They had done this before and they were judged. And they keep doing the wrong thing again and again. This people had learned nothing. They'd learned nothing. Now, it doesn't make them anything extraordinary. It makes them humans. It makes them sinners. It makes them probably like the average person, for that matter, that doesn't usually learn God's truth very quickly. often resists it. And we've heard these words before in verse 3. If only we died with our brethren, died before the Lord. If only we'd been judged with them instantly all those years ago. Why have you brought us up, the assembly of the Lord in verse 4, into this wilderness, that we and our animals should die here? Why have you made us come out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It's not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there any water to drink. Well, the answer is because you didn't want to go in the promised land. That's why they were there. The reason why they were there for 40 years is because they didn't believe God, and so they wouldn't go in the promised land, and they would not accept the consequences. And so they blamed Moses, as they had done again and again. And so Moses and Aaron, as they had previously, go before God in verse 6. God's glory appears to them. And God says to Moses in verse 8, take the rod, you and your brother Aaron together, and your brother gather the congregation together. Is it like a shepherd's staff stick? And God says in verse 7, speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. There's a very simple command. When God brought water out of the rock in Exodus 17, he tells Moses to strike it, and water comes. This time it's a different command. He says, strike it, don't speak to it. Sorry, speak to the rock. Let's try this again. So you're all clear. So you've got it straight. None of you are confused. Moses strikes the rock the first time, water comes. Second time, he's got to speak to the rock. You might say the rock has already been hit once. The rock has been bruised once. And this rock is not some little pebble, not some stone out of a rock garden. This is rock from the face of a cliff. Think of all the water that is needed to give drink and sustenance to a couple of million people. So what does Moses do? In verse 9, he took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him, and they gathered the assembly in verse 10. He said to them, and this is before he does anything, he's got to say something. God just told him to go and to speak to the rock. And he says, I'm going to speak to these people first. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say something to them. And he says to them, hear now, you rebels. And they were rebels. But guess what? They're God's rebels. You problem people, but they're God's problem people. Moses talking like he owns them. Must we bring water? So Moses was a source of water all those years ago. Moses didn't source the water. God sourced the water. Must we bring water for you out of this rock? Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice. Didn't just hit it once. That rock copped a hiding, you'd say. You could see him striking that with some fierceness and frustration. Twice. Now, wouldn't you think that Moses, in disobeying God twice, that rock was going to stay rock? Yeah? Stay rock. But water, in verse 11, came out abundantly. How much? The congregation and their animals drank. It's interesting. God's people are complaining. Moses is disobeying. And God blesses them with water. This makes no sense to me. This makes no sense. But it's true. Though everyone's out of sorts, God is blessing them. He's blessing them with water. Don't you see that this blessing of God was nothing to do with them. It was to do with God's promise he'd made to the people. It has to be. There's no other reason why God would give them this water when everyone is doing their own thing, including the leaders. Moses said in Numbers 12 that he is the meekest man on the earth. Moses is going to die soon, and isn't it apparent that Moses, the meekest man on earth, wasn't meek that day? Wasn't meek that day. His sanctification was far from complete. Far from complete. No one shines in this story but God. Well, what's the problem? Look at verse 12. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, and he says, look, because you did not believe me. But that was true of the people 40 years earlier. They didn't believe him. Now, Moses and Aaron aren't believing God. But then God says to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel. When I think of the word hallow, I think of the Lord's Prayer. You know, we all grew up learning about the Lord's Prayer in the King James. Hallowed be thy name. Hallowed be thy name. And we didn't have a clue what that hallow meant. But it sounded good. There's this idea of God's name being set apart, being made special before people. And so when Moses and Aaron didn't believe God, didn't trust him, they failed to set him apart in the eyes of God's people. In other words, Moses and Aaron were presenting God as being untrustworthy. That's what they were doing. I mean, if the leaders are projecting God cannot be trusted, I know better, then the people have every excuse to do what they want. Moses and Aaron had become the rebels that God said his people were. It's a tragedy. Now in Psalm 106 it says that the people provoked Moses, but provocation is never a complete defense. Provocation is never a complete defense. We get provoked all the time, but it's never a complete defense, is it? Something God may take into account at times, but it's never an excuse to sin. Yes, Moses has lost his sister. He's mourning for her, and he has to lead these people 40 years. This is an awfully difficult assignment that he has. But Moses stumbles at the end. Think about that. We think temptation in life and in the ministry is for the young men and women. No. It's when you're in your 80s. It's when you're in your 80s. Don't think Brother Jack Pettifer's safe either. Don't think he's clear of temptation. He probably gets it the worst. So temptation happens at every age. At every age. And we have the capacity to succeed or fail at any step of the journey, any step. Moses' 40 years of faithfulness didn't mean that he was exempt in that last lap. Someone said it was actually unbelief and rebellion that threatened death in the wilderness, not a lack of water. The lack of water wasn't the problem in the wilderness. It was their attitude, their lack of faith. In 1 Corinthians 10 it says, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. And 1 Corinthians 10 is to do in part with the story of Numbers and the wilderness temptations. Temptation is a danger at any age. You don't believe me? Numbers 20. And so God tells them at the end of verse 12 that he would not bring the assembly into the land which I have given them. Now look at verse 13 of Numbers 20. This was the water of Meribah, quarreling, because the children of Israel contended with the Lord and he was hallowed among them. When God gave the water out of the rock in Exodus 17, the place was called Massa and Meribah, testing and quarreling. Now he just calls the place Meribah. It was a place of just quarreling and arguing, and yet God was hallowed among them. God says to his people, listen, despite what Moses just did, despite what he just did, and a penalty him and Aaron are going to pay, I will still give you water. That's faithfulness. That's grace. That's grace. That's unconditional grace of God, and God will vindicate himself. Now, there is one other episode in Numbers 20 before we look at the death of Aaron, the high priest. And this is where Moses is going to take his people to the very borders of the promised land. And if you look at verse 14 of Numbers 20, Moses sends messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom. Now, these are old relatives. These are old relatives. The Edomites were descendants of Esau, the twin of Jacob. So he sends messengers, and this is all very formal. Look at verse 14. Thus says your brother Israel. It's emphasizing family ties. You know all the hardship that has befallen us, how our fathers went down to Egypt. We dwelt in Egypt a long time, and the Egyptians afflicted us with our fathers. When we cried to the Lord, he heard our voice, sent the angel, and brought us out of Egypt. Now we are here in Kadesh, a city on the edge of your border. Please let us pass through your country. They want to take a shortcut. That's what they want to do. And the guarantee is we'll not pass through fields or vineyards, we'll not drink water from wells. This is a large company of people, We'll go along the King's Highway. This is a well-known trade route. We'll not turn aside to the right hand or the left. We cause no trouble. We're not going to get distracted. We're not staying. We're going through until we have passed through your territory. Perfectly reasonable request. But there's nothing going to be easy about getting to the promised land. There's nothing easy about it. There's going to be no shortcuts. And Edom says to him in verse 18, you shall not pass through my land, lest I come out against you with the sword. You know, Jacob and Esau had settled their differences long ago. But the king of Edom, he's acting like there's unfinished business. It was unnecessary. It was unnecessary. Edom would be creating a problem for his people in the future by failing to respect and to help God's people. And of course, in verse 19, they appear, look, we're just going to go straight through. We're not going to go, we're not going to use any of your resources. Just let us pass through. And they say no in verse 20. So Edom came out against them with many men and with a strong hand. Reminds us of what Esau did when he meets Jacob in the book of Genesis. The point of these verses is that Israel wanted to have a peaceful approach to its neighbours. They weren't interested in exterminating Edom. They wanted to get to the promised land. They wanted to live peaceably with their neighbours. That's what they wanted. They just wanted to get where God wanted them to get, and yet there are always problems and complications in life. It's true today, true in ministry. And yet we have this historical detail that God takes later in the book of Obadiah and says, I'll take care of Edom. I remember them. They gave you a hard time. I will judge them one day for the trouble that they have caused God's people. Now, at the end of this chapter in Numbers 22, from 22 to 29, we read it this morning in our Bible reading. We have the death of Aaron. And it's strange reading because God sort of tells Moses, listen, he's going to die. And before he does, you're going to take his priestly robes off. You're going to put him on his son, and then you're going to bury him, right? I mean, this is God just virtually disposing of Aaron. Why? Because Aaron's purpose had come to an end. Like Moses, he would not see the promised land due to unbelief, but that's not his whole life. That's just one episode in his life. Nonetheless, he served God. many, many years. Many, many years. None of us serve God without blemishes, without detours, without some dead ends. None of us have a life that is without spots. None of us have that. But God's purpose for Aaron came to an end, and so Moses was going to bury him. Someone said, Numbers 20, Miriam dead, Aaron dead, Moses dying. That was very, very, very bleak, very bleak. You have this end of a generation. This is a great team. This is a great team. Did they have their sibling rivalries and falling outs? Yes, but by and large, they kept things together. They kept things together. They served God. Miriam was a great woman. Aaron, a great priest. Moses, a great leader. And yet, it's going to come to an end. An end. Aaron's high priestly tasks end on his death. And his son Eleazar is right there, is right there. Eleazar is installed and his father Aaron dies. Look at verse 28. Aaron died there on the side of the mountain. Then Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain. They mourn Aaron 30 days. It's not often you lose a high priest. You're not supposed to either. He was to be a symbol of continuity and faithfulness. This was the man responsible for the bringing of the offerings. This was the man who would keep us close to God. But a human priesthood was always going to be a temporary thing. Temporary thing because people die. People die. You're only going to get a few decades out of them. And they keep dying. This priesthood would keep on changing hands. But then think about what the New Testament says about our high priest, Jesus Christ. And the scripture tells us that in effect it was his death, burial, and his resurrection, then his ascension, that commenced his high priesthood for sinners and for his people, redeemed sinners. And that priesthood never ends. Jesus will never be replaced. He's irreplaceable. He won't die again. He's died once, he's risen, he's ascended. His death, burial, resurrection, and ascension is when his priesthood began and continues to this day. There's no need for a human priesthood. No need for a human priesthood. You know, from time to time, I'll get a phone call from a funeral home and say, and they'll say, "Hi, can I? Are you a Baptist priest?" And I'll say, "Yes, I am. Thank you." And we keep talking, but you know what I mean. I'm not going to confuse them. I'll tell them later I'm a pastor, but we don't have a human priesthood as such. Now, all believers are priests, but there's no exclusive human singular priest. We have the God-man Jesus Christ, who is our great high priest. But God looked after his people with another generation. Moses would be replaced by Joshua. Aaron's replaced by his son. Moses replaced by Joshua. There will be another generation of leaders. Now, in conclusion today, I want to go back just a little to that striking of the rock incident. Remember, Moses strikes the rock in Exodus 17. And instead of speaking to the rock, he strikes it twice. And the problem was not just Moses' disobedience. It wasn't just that he had not set apart God's name to his people. But Moses had terribly defaced a precious type of what Jesus Christ would do. When Moses struck the rock and out of the striking came water, that striking came water and life, that speaks to us of a greater one who would come, who would die on the cross, who would be struck, smitten of God, afflicted, and out of that death would come life. Come life. And so when Moses strikes the rock a second time, he is doing great injury to what that first striking signified. Christ will only die once. Only die once. He said it is finished on the cross. It's finished. And it's still finished. His work at Calvary is a present tense finishing. When you have religious tradition saying that what we call as communion or the Lord's Supper is a repetition of the sacrifice, you are striking the lamb again. You're striking him again. And God views that very seriously. The lamb has been struck once. And God was satisfied with that. He was satisfied with that. He accepted the suffering. He accepted it. And so we should too. We should cease from our own works and put our faith and trust in Jesus Christ.